Welcome to Pop Culture Retro, which was recently voted the 15th best podcast by the residents of the Golden Years Retirement Community in Boca Raton, Florida. Each show will revisit some of your favorite pop culture memories with insider and outsider perspectives. Now, please help me welcome your hosts, Ike Eisenmann and Jonathan Rosen.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Pop Culture Retro. I'm one of your hosts, Jonathan Rosen, along with Ike Eisenmann, and today we are thrilled to welcome an award-winning author, director, and screenwriter who directed such classics as Time After Time, as well as directing Ike in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. He's the author of the best-selling Sherlock Holmes novel, The 7% Solution, and his memoir, The View from the Bridge, Memories of Star Trek and a Life in Hollywood. Please help us welcome a fellow New Yorker, Nicholas Meyer. Nick, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Well, your career is incredible, and we have much to cover. But before we begin, I need to know, is this the first time you're seeing Ike's in Star Trek II?
I think it is.
Actually, you and I did a Q&A after a screening of Wrath of Khan at the Chinese Theater in Hollywood. It was many years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
There were a few other people from the production that were there as well. So yeah, that was the last time we saw each other, but this will be a nice extended conversation for a change.
We can't keep meeting this often.
I was reading your fascinating memoir, The View from the Bridge. It's a great book, which I highly recommend to everyone. But I kept rereading one of the early pages to make sure I was looking at it right. As a kid, you had a meal with Einstein. So how did that happen, and what was he like?
Well, I don't remember much about the meal. I was about 7 years old. My uncle, Harold Chernis, was at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study. He was the foremost Hellenist in the world. I did not understand this. I just thought he was my much beloved uncle. And my family, on a couple of Thanksgivings, I think there were 2, chose to leave New York City and go to Princeton, where my father's sister was married to Harold Chernis. If you read American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin, my uncle's all the way through it. My uncle was introduced by my aunt when they were all at Berkeley to Robert Oppenheimer, who wanted to study Sanskrit. And I believe my uncle, Harold Chernis, was the second PhD in Sanskrit in America after Arthur Ryder. This is a very long-winded answer, but that's how Oppenheimer and Harold Chernis became friends. At the end of the war, when Oppenheimer became head of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, he brought my aunt and uncle to be at Princeton, where they spent the last, 40 years of their lives at 98 Battle Road, across from the Institute. And so we, as I say, went there for a couple of Thanksgivings. And I don't remember any of this except in the vaguest terms, so you have to take this with a ton of salt. But I sat across from Oppenheimer and his wife, Kitty, who was behaving in a way that I didn't quite understand. I had never seen an intoxicated person, so I didn't know what was wrong with her. My uncle was there. Erwin Panofsky was there, the foremost art historian in the world. I didn't understand that either. He was just this funny guy. And on my right was Albert Einstein, who was also at the Institute. And that's how I was at Thanksgiving dinner with them. And the only story that I remember. Well, I don't remember it. I was told it. I said, I have a hair in my turkey. And Einstein said, not so loud, everyone else will want one.
Oh my God, that's incredible. And I have to say right off the bat, I read your memoir some time ago. I have recommended it many times on this show, and to anyone who will listen who wants to learn anything about forging a career in Hollywood, because it's in my opinion, now I have not read a lot of Hollywood memoirs, but one of the very best ones I could imagine about a success story in the business. And it's so well written. The stories are fantastic, and I was even more informed about so many different things than I ever expected to. So I just have to thank you for writing it, period.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for reading it, and thank you for endorsing it and for your kind words. That's nice to hear.
You're very welcome. Well, one of the things you mentioned, of course, now going back to the beginning of your career, that you started thinking about a career in cinema after watching the David Niven classic Around the World in 80 Days. So what was it about that movie that really inspired you to embark on this madness?
Well, you have to back up, which is that I was always, from the time I was extremely small, enchanted by stories. I just loved listening to them and sort of making them up. I didn't think very much. When people say, when did you decide to become a writer? I said, I don't recall ever deciding any such thing. It was just something that I always did. And I was a big Jules Verne fan, from the Jules Verne and Arthur Conan Doyle. I think my dad introduced me to the complete Holmes stories when I was about 11. And I also, this is a very long-winded answer, which seemed to be the only kind I give. I think that childhood experiences are sometimes the most enduring, whether you're talking about people that you've encountered, places you've been, or art that you've experienced. That's books, that's movies, that's the ballet, or whatever it was. And so I was totally hooked on Jules Verne. And at that time, which was the 1950s, there was, starting with the Walt Disney 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a whole spate of Jules Verne novels that were being turned into movies. I still maintain that the Walt Disney 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is the best movie that Disney ever made. And I was hooked on that. And for my 11th birthday, I was taken to the Rivoli Theater in Midtown New York to see the Mike Todd Around the World in 80 Days movie. And I had a religious experience. I was like Saul of Tarsus, struck blind on the road to Damascus. This was it. And there was a program, which I still have, which you could buy in the theater, $2, published by, I think, Random House, all these articles about the making of the movie. And there was one article that said, you too can make a motion picture. No previous experience necessary. And it was a sort of sarcastic article about Mike Todd, who had never made a movie before. He was a Broadway producer. And, you know, all you need is $5 million and 12,000 people in 6 different countries, and you too can make a motion picture. But I was 11 and I didn't get the sarcasm. I just got the headline. You too can make a motion picture. No previous experience necessary. So I turned to my dad, who was equally enchanted by the Mike Todd movie, whatever one thinks of it now. And I said, I want to make a movie. We have an 8mm Revere wind-up camera. Can you help me? And of course, not being the most original mind, I wanted to make the movie I had just seen. So my dad and I spent the next 5 years on weekends, on school vacations, on summer holidays, making our 8mm version of Around the World in 80 Days. My best friend played Passepartout. I played Phileas Fogg, of course. And that's how I got into my movie infatuation. Kind of long-winded, but there it is.
Well, I want to talk about the 7% Solution, the Sherlock Holmes novel you wrote. You know, yes,
I've now written. Excuse me. I've now written 6 of them. The next one is coming out in August. Sherlock Holmes and the Telegram from Hell. So as long as we're, there's the 7% Solution. There's the West End Horror. There's the Canary Trainer. There's the Adventure of the Peculiar Protocols. There's the Return of the Pharaoh. All of this, I have to say, I never say, can be found on my website, which is nicholas-meyer.com. So yeah, I'm pushing my books.
Of course. Well, we were going to mention that anyway, but this was the first one for you to write, the Sherlock Holmes novel. And how daunting is it to write a novel on such an iconic character? I mean, were you at all concerned that Holmes fans would react negatively to a new book by a different author?
Well, first of all, I was not the first person to write an imitation Holmes novel. I don't like the word pastiche. It's become pejorative, but there were others. Ellery Queen did A Study in Terror, and other people. There are 60 Sherlock Holmes novels, 60, which is to say 56 short stories and 4 novellas. And when you get to the end of them, and remember I said earlier that childhood experiences, there's a reason why we call it an impressionable age, because you're really impressed and things get imprinted. So I read those Holmes stories when I was 11, and my dad gave me all of them. And you get very depressed when you've reached the end and there are no more. So there is a natural impulse to maybe fool around with writing one of your own. You asked whether I was worried about reaction, and the answer was no, because either I was too stupid, or also because Sherlock Holmes was on the wane. He was on the decline. Until I wrote the 7% Solution, which is largely credited with bringing Sherlock Holmes back to everybody's front and center consciousness. Maybe it wasn't that simple, but the fact that the book became a #1 bestseller on the New York Times list for something like 40 weeks revived people's interest in this character, who had become a bit of a sort of a fringe. There were always Holmes fanatics, but it was not ubiquitous as it is now. There's a Sherlock Holmes Society in every city on the planet. There are 2 in Tokyo, and so I think it could be argued that the book played some part, and then the movie, and then the Oscar nomination for the screenplay and so on, played a part in reviving it. Somebody said, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. And I just, I was 27 years old when I started writing it. And I told, I thought it was in the public domain, which it wasn't. So I had to make a deal with the Conan Doyle estate. Now it is in the public domain, and everybody's taking a whack at Sherlock Holmes stories. But I wasn't looking over my shoulder at the time. I was just The Writers Guild at the time was, as we always are, on strike. And so I wasn't allowed to write screenplays. So I would come home from picketing and work on my Sherlock Holmes novel.
Well, you mentioned it's a bestseller. It becomes a huge bestseller. So how does your life change after that that happens?
Oh, it changed a lot. It's changed a lot. I was a fairly obscure person, and suddenly, I was on TV, on talk shows, and I could see myself in the New York Times week after week on those bestseller lists. It was very intoxicating. I told myself it couldn't have happened to a nicer person. I also think that I was 28 years old, and I was old enough at that point not to kid myself that the book was more significant than it was. I didn't tell myself that I had written the great American novel. Maybe 2 years earlier, I might have been confused. But by 28, I thought, okay, what you have written is an enormously exhilarating, joyful, smart book, but it isn't, great literature. It's just fun, and well done of its kind. So I enjoyed what was happening to me without deceiving myself as to the possibility that it had greater significance. What it did was it opened up professional avenues to me. So when I wrote the movie and the script got an Academy Award nomination, that opened up more avenues to me. So when I wrote Time After Time and said I would sell the screenplay if I got to direct it, the fact that I had written a bestseller, adapted it as a screenplay, that it had been nominated for an Oscar, all of that played into my credibility, my resume, so that Warner Brothers and Orion said, okay, you can direct it.
Well, you want to go back to writing the screenplay for the 7% Solution. So you said in your memoir that you were willing to cut more from the book than director Herb Ross wanted. How difficult is it to, I guess, take a guy to your work and say this can go, that can go?
It's an interesting question. I find that it's not difficult for me at all, which is why Herb Ross, the director, was so shocked when I said, we have to cut this, we have to cut that. And he would say, no, everybody loves the tennis game. We can't cut the tennis game. And I said, well, it isn't like Strangers on a Train where the murderer is going to plant the cigarette lighter and we're going to stop the movie and watch two guys play tennis, but he insisted. And as it turns out, he was right. I think that learning to be ruthless, and when I looked at the novel and I thought there are things about this novel that I think are really good and things that I think I could do better, in the sense of letting the movie be a chance to improve on things. The other, and principally having to do with the mystery that Holmes, working in partnership with Sigmund Freud, have to solve. And I think that the mystery, and I went and saw I read the book Presumed Innocent, and then I watched the movie with millions of other people because it was a best-selling book and they made it to a big movie with Harrison Ford. And my problem was that, having read the book, I knew who done it. I knew who the killer was. And I thought, gee, if 2 million people have now read the 7% Solution, and it was something like that, they're going to know all the mystery parts. And since I didn't think the mystery was so terrific in the first place, maybe I could improve the mystery and throw people a little off balance, since you now couldn't just sit back and say, oh, yes, I know where this is going, because you didn't. So it wasn't hard for me to be ruthless. I spent a lot of time in the theater directing plays and trying to be an actor, and you learn that if it doesn't work, you have to cut it out. And sometimes you have to cut out things that you really love. You may get an idea for a scene, and you may write a whole movie or a whole book around that scene. And when you're finished, you discover that the one thing that no longer belongs is the scene that prompted the whole thing. And that's a very hard cut to make, because you feel obscurely disloyal to something somewhere. It seems wrong to cut that. Or you've spent hours getting a shot of a sunset for your movie or a sunrise, and then when you cut the whole movie together, you know, this shot is unnecessary. It slows down the action, and it doesn't matter how many hours you spent waiting for the sun to be in such and such a position. It's got to go.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've had to learn that lesson in my own creative process. I've heard other people talk about exactly that. If you're not willing to cut the thing you're most in love with, you're not going to pull, get the best out of your story. I mean, so I can relate to that. Any budding writers out there should take this information and ingest it deeply and remember it, because it's very true. Well, you also had a hand in casting the film version, and you tell a great story on how Robert Duval got cast, as well as how his acting taught you a little about filmmaking for later. Can you share that with us?
Sure. I almost never have liked any Sherlock Holmes movies, and we can talk about why I don't like them, but I only liked the Arthur Conan Doyle stories. There are a couple of Sherlock Holmes movies that I do like, or television series, but in the main, I prefer the originals. So, and I particularly didn't like the Basil Rathbone, Nigel Bruce movies for two reasons, or maybe three. I could never see Basil Rathbone thinking. And the whole thing about Sherlock Holmes is he's a thinker. And there are actors that you can watch and you can see the wheels turning, which is the best kind of film acting, is when the face reveals what's going on beneath the skin. And Rathbone, he sort of looked like Sherlock Holmes and he sounded like Sherlock Holmes, but I didn't see the wheels turning. But worse than that for me was Nigel Bruce as Dr. Watson, because he plays him as a buffoon, and I could never understand why a genius hangs out with a buffoon. And that Nigel Bruce character never seemed to me to be the guy who was writing the stories that I was in love with. So when it came time to cast our movie, we wanted, Herb Ross, the director, and I, people to re-look at these people with the dust blown off. And that Watson is not a jerk. He's an average man. Holmes is too sophisticated to require he's very vain. He wants the admiration of somebody, but not somebody who is a jerk. Watson is a substitute for the audience. That's us. So casting Nicole Williamson and casting Alan Arkin, which was my idea, and casting Robert Duval, we heard he was interested in playing Watson. And I thought, oh my God, this is such a brilliant actor, and he wants to do this. we should, they don't audition, movie stars don't audition, they meet. You have a meeting. So we had temporary offices at the time at MGM, and Robert Duval came in to audition, came in to meet. And it was the same day that he was auditioning for the role of Woody Guthrie in Bound for Glory. And for whatever reason, he came in as Woody Guthrie. He had a buckskin jacket on and this kind of Appalachian accent. And Herb Ross are kind of looking at each other out of his eye line and going, what is this? And finally, after, chit-chatting, he got up and pulled a cassette out of his pocket and said, well, I'll bring you a cassette of me talking like Dr. Watson, and so you can have a listen. And then he left. And this is a very long story, and I don't know how much time we're going to devote to all this stuff. But the long and the short of it was that on the cassette, he was good enough to deceive several English speakers for whom we played the cassette, and that's how he got the role. As to what I learned from his performance, when we were looking at the dailies, we couldn't see him doing a thing. And I remembered saying to Herb Ross, can you utz him? Can you something? Because doesn't seem to be much going on. And Herb tried, and Duval grew very testy and said, what do you want, me making faces? So we sort of backed off that. And then when we saw the finished movie, he kind of walks away with it because his was the most subtle performance. And that's when I learned about film acting is, the closer the camera gets, the less you have to do. Especially if you are one of those actors where you can see the wheels going around. You can see the thoughts and the emotions. Gary Cooper had that. James Mason had it. I mean, there's lots of actors who do have it. And then there are those who do not.
You mentioned Time After Time, your directorial debut in that. Great movie with Malcolm McDowell, David Warner, Mary Steenburgen. I love this film. The basic premise is H.G. Wells chasing Jack the Ripper through time. So you touched upon it briefly. So how did that come to you? How did that all come about for you?
Well, it wasn't my idea, because most things are not my idea. In my experience, the whole history of art is a history of cut and paste. And in this case, while my book was on the bestseller list, or maybe it was the movie, I can't remember, I was approached by a fellow alumnus from the University of Iowa, which is where I went to college, as I was only an undergrad. And he had been in graduate school in the playwriting department. And he called himself Carl Alexander, which was actually not his real name. His real name was Carl Thunberg, which was the same name as his uncle, who wrote Old Yeller and gets screen credit on the 1959 Ben-Hur. So the uncle said, please change your name so you're not mistaken for me. So he called himself Carl Alexander. And I heard from a lot of people when the book came out and the movie, people I hadn't heard from in years. And Carl got in touch with me and he said, I've written a novel, or I'm writing a novel, that is sort of inspired by the 7% solution. Would you read what I've got and tell me what you think? So in those days, I had time. And I said, okay. So he sent me 65 pages of a novel which was called The Time Travelers. And I read them, and I gave him my 2 cents about what I thought about it. And then I forgot about it. Except I didn't forget about it because I couldn't forget about it because it was such a cool idea. H.G. Wells, Jack the Ripper, time travel. I would never have come up with this in a million years. But I also thought, wow, this is inherently a visual idea. Two guys running around modern times in Victorian outfits. It's not even expensive. It's only the two guys in period clothes. And I was always very influenced, or I now was influenced, by a Jean-Luc Godard movie. I think it was Jean-Luc Godard, called Alphaville. And Alphaville is a French sci-fi movie in which everything is the same as the world that we know, except that it all has different names. So you would say, hand me that communicator, and they'd give you a book. So it was all in the eyes of the audience, what was special or sci-fi. And I realized that the premise of what became Time After Time was visually the same thing. And I thought, gosh, what a pity. What a pity that it's a book. It really should be a... And then, while I was composing how I thought it should go in my head, weeks later, I woke up in the middle of the night and said, well, you're an idiot. Why don't you option his story? Which I did. I optioned it. And then I wrote the screenplay. And then I handed it to him and said, here, help yourself. Because I figured whatever he took if it helped the book get published, that these would be tie-ins, they would cross-fertilize. And that's how the script got written, the book got written, and the movie got made.
Well, now this is your directorial debut. How much pressure was that to take that on for the first time?
Well, it was a lot. I had directed radio plays. I had directed on stage a fair amount. But aside from my childhood around the world at 80 Days project, I was coming very late to the camera. So I made the same speech to everybody on the crew that I met. And I said, number one, you're going to have to teach me. Number two, you're going to have to not mind teaching me. And number three, if I still want to do it my way, you can't go away angry. And anybody who could withstand that catechism was okay. And I had great producers, Herb Jaffe and his son Steve, Steve, who has been my partner ever since, and who shot the second unit sequences in Star Trek VI and the second unit sequences in The Day After. And they unfurled a red carpet for me to keep walking on. I never knew how lucky I was. And they only showed me, sort of the best people to work on the film, whether we're talking about Don Camburn to edit Time After Time. He had edited Easy Rider, among other things. Or Paul Lohman, who shot Robert Altman's movies, and so forth. So I was really working with and Ed Carfagno, who designed the Time Machine. And of course, the Time Machine, I showed him the Nautilus from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And I said, like this, see? And Carfagno, who had designed the Joe Mankiewicz Julius Caesar, the Shakespeare Julius Caesar movie, and worked on Ben-Hur and so forth, was really a brilliant production designer. And so I was working with top of the line people, and they didn't mind helping me. And this is a little anecdote, but one of my favorite moments making Time After Time was we shot a close-up of Malcolm McDowell as H.G. Wells, and he said a line, and then we broke for lunch. And everybody went off to get something to eat. And a guy who was way up high in the rafters, lighting guy, came down and said, you're the writer of this thing, aren't you, as well as the director? And I said, yes. And he said, well, if you're asking me, he was saying the wrong thing just now, right there. And I said, he was? What should he say? And he then quoted a line from earlier in the movie, which he felt deserved to be reprised at this moment. And he was right. His line, my line, was suddenly not only bad, it was incredibly bad. It was really stupid. It was so wretched that I thought I was going to gag just thinking about it. And then I thought, hang on a minute, you're the director. Bring him back after lunch and shoot, his reiteration of my earlier line, which is exactly what we did. And I loved this moment, this experience, because this man was involved enough in what was going on to want to help beyond where he aimed the light. And B, that he felt comfortable enough on my set to make that suggestion. I'm not Stanley Kubrick. I didn't kid myself that I was omniscient. And so I needed all the help I could get. And once word got around to the rest of the crew about this story, I got a lot of great suggestions. I didn't necessarily take them. I didn't necessarily take them all, but I took a lot. And the other thing was that I can't remember what the other thing was, but they helped. Oh, I know. It was just that if you compare Hollywood crews and European crews, if you're watching dailies as we used to do with the crew, and you turn to the costumer in America and say, what did you think of the scene? She'll say, well, the hems were all straight. In other words, she only relates to it in terms of what her function was, the costumer. But in Europe, if you said this, they would discuss the scene. And so what I was getting from my American crew was a kind of overlap where now people were just contributing to the idea of the movie as opposed to just their limited thing. And that was
That's fantastic. Yeah, you dropped off at the very end of that, but it is.
That's what happens to me.
Yeah, well, yeah.
We all drop off at the very end, by the way. I'm just saying.
Well, I'm dying to talk to you about, of course, my favorite movie that you've ever made, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, and I have to interject for a moment, just like with my experience in this. One of the smaller parts that I have ever done, and yet I get more attention for being in that film than I do Escape to Witch Mountain that I co-starred in. So clearly, we all know what a amazing phenomenon it's been. Just a quick thank you for pulling that off, first of all. But what's funny about the whole thing is you weren't exactly a fan of Star Trek growing up, were you?
I'd never seen it.
Well, then how did you end up getting involved in it?
I got involved in it through a childhood friend from Cape Cod, I mean, who summered up there as I did, named Karen Moore. And Karen Moore at the time was an executive at Paramount Pictures, and she was at my place on a Sunday, as I recall, and we were barbecuing hamburgers. And for some reason, I was wanting to do a certain movie and I wasn't getting to do it. And I was turning away offers after time to do this, to do that. And I was saying, no, 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 I only want to do this novel by Robertson Davies, and that's it. And she said, you're not going to learn how to direct movies by sitting up here holding your breath or sulking like Achilles in his tent. Why don't you come and meet Harv Bennett down at Paramount? He's in charge of doing the second Star Trek movie. And I said, is that the one with a man with pointy ears? And she said, you know, you're a real snob, which was probably true. And she said, don't be such a snob. Come down and talk to Harv. And I don't remember, you know, my decision-making process, but I went down, and what happened, I don't know about relations with Star Trek, which is a whole other story, but I did kind of fall hard for Harv Bennett. We got along like a house on fire. And so he started to show me Star Trek. He showed me the movie, and he showed me some of the episodes. And for the longest time, I really didn't understand what I was looking at, and I think it's fair to say I missed everything important that Star Trek has to offer. But it did vaguely put me in mind of something that I did love. Again, we're going back to childhood experiences, the impressionable age. In this case, I think I was around 13 when I started reading the novels of C.S. Forester. He called himself C.S. Forester, that wasn't his name, who wrote The African Queen, and he also wrote a series of novels about Captain Horatio Hornblower. Captain Hornblower was a captain in the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars, and he had a girl in every port, and he had lots of adventures. And when you're 13, this sounds pretty cool. Maybe it still sounds pretty cool, or maybe I just have never grown up. So I thought, oh, this is Captain Hornblower in outer space. This is the Navy. This is destroyers and submarines, and I know how to do that. And that's how I became involved with it. And by the way, that is not the full explanation of what is important, significant, meaningful, wonderful about Star Trek. It was just a way in for me. And I spent the next 40 years slowly, because I am not the sharpest knife in the drawer, understanding what it was about Star Trek that is important, that is meaningful. But that was the way in. And that's how I could relate to it at the time.
Wow. Well, you had your own sets of problems with getting the movie greenlit. Can you explain some of them with regard to the script?
Well, I'm not sure that I didn't recognize them as problems because the whole thing happened really gradually. Harv Bennett, I said, oh, okay, fine. Once I sort of got the hornblower analogy, I thought, okay, I can do this. And Harv said, great. Draft 5 of the screenplay is coming in. And So I said, okay. And then I waited for it, and I looked up, and it was maybe 3 weeks later. And I called him and said, what happened to the script? And he said, I, I can't send it to you. It's not very good. His language was more colorful, but I won't quote him here. But I said, so what about draft 4 or draft 3? And he said, you don't understand. These 5 scripts are merely 5 discrete attempts to get a second Star Trek movie going. They're not related. And I said, well, can you send them up? Can I read them? Because by now I'm jonesing to make my outer space opera. And so I said, well, if you want. And in those days, you didn't hit send. A van drove up with piles of scripts, because it wasn't just draft 2 or 3 or 4. It was draft 2 revisions, draft 3 revisions, then starting over with a difference, and so on and so on and so forth. So, and I'm a slow reader, and I'm a slow thinker, and I plowed through these. And basically what I proposed was that we, Harv Bennett, his producing partner, Robert Sallin, and me, would make a laundry list of things that we liked in these 5 scripts. That it would be the major plot, the subplot, a sequence, a scene, a character, a line of dialogue, didn't matter. Just write it all down. And then I would try to write a new script that encapsulated or embodied or somehow worked in as much of this stuff as I could. And well, they said, yeah, but the problem is if we don't have a script in 12 days, the special effects house, Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, they can't promise to deliver shots in time for the June opening. And I said, what June opening? And they said, well, the picture's opening on June something. I said, wait a minute, you got a movie that doesn't exist and you've booked it into theaters? And they said something, that's how it's always done or something. And I said, well, okay, I think I can do this in 12 days, but we got to start now. What? And they didn't look happy, and I didn't understand why. And they said, well, we couldn't even make your deal in 12 days. And I said, look, forget about the deal, forget about the money, forget about the credit. If we don't do this, I'm not talking about the directing part, that's settled. But if we don't do this now, today, you're not going to have a movie. So they kind of looked shocked, but I was young and stupid. So that's how I sat down in 12 days and cobbled together what was in essence what became the script. We revised it endlessly, but it was like amending the Constitution. The basic thing was there. And then we just kept improving it. That's sort of how it came about. I don't remember much about the 12 days, but if you're referring to problems in creating the script, that's what it was. And then later, and I like this story because it's also true, when they were doing the DVD of The Wrath of Khan, they were doing those extras where they interview people to talk, and I told the story I had just told you. And Lynn O'Leary, who was head of DVDs at Paramount, called me a day or so later and said, the lawyers say that we can't use anything that you said because they didn't want to get in trouble with the Writers Guild. And I said, well, if I can't tell the truth about what happened, then take me out of the DVD. I don't want to be in it. And she said, well, that's what I hoped you would say. Now I have some ammo. So she went back and called me a day or so later, and she said, okay, here's what we're going to do. And what they decided became the standard for every movie studio, with all these ancillary interviews. And it's a little box that comes on and says, the ideas and opinions expressed in this interview are not those of Paramount Pictures and its affiliates, and do not reflect blah, blah, blah. And every studio does this now. That quotation, that disclaimer. And what that does is that instead of just being bland puff pieces about each movie or whatever, it opens it up to being real oral histories. So people can tell their version, accurate or not, self-serving or not, of what they remember happened during the making of the movie. And yeah, that was the result. That's my screenplay experience. Most of the dialogue in The Wrath of Khan, I would say 90-something%, is written by me. Those are my words. Harv Bennett wrote about 10 memorable lines of dialogue. Would you like a tranquilizer? Captain, this is the garden spot of CD Alpha 5. And I can, point to them, but the rest of it is pretty much mine.
I'm just curious now, you mentioned the motion picture, the Star Trek, the motion picture, which made money but wasn't a critical success, and had a lot of problems during filming. So Star Trek 2, it was make or break for the series. I mean, how much pressure was on you for that? Did you feel it? Did you feel that coming from Paramount?
No.
Really?
I was too dumb to think about series. I didn't think about any of that. All I thought about, and by the way, I don't think they were thinking about it yet either. I think they started to think hard about it when they saw the dailies and saw the rough cut of the movie and thought, hang on a minute, maybe this thing is not as, they gave it to the TV division to produce, and we did it for about a quarter of the budget of the first one. And then suddenly it looked like, oh, could be really good. And then, Leonard started thinking about, and Paramount started thinking about, do we really want to kill Spock if there's, more blood in the turnip? And then things got very, very different. But up until that point, I just was largely left alone to do the movie.
Well, it's just, clearly for the best, especially looking back on it. But so let's talk about the cast for a minute, which, you already have this established cast headed by William Shatner and these characters. How was their response to you? And were there egos involved that made it difficult for you in any way?
The short answer to that is no. The cast was used to working with different directors all the time, week after week when they were doing the original series. They and Robert Wise came before me, and they were professionals, and they were extremely helpful. And one of the actors might say to me, this isn't the way Uhura talks. And I would say, how does she talk, and so forth. So I never had ego problems or anything like that. They had, I think, some of them, more problems with one another than they did with me. These were people who had all been chosen by the fickle finger of fate to be in a television show which yoked them at the hip for the rest of their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And whether they wanted to or not, but this is how they were sending their kids to college and so forth. So they had to make the best of it. And I think I was not, a problem person. I think I'm normally pretty easy to get along with. A lot of times in this business, you hear that so-and-so is difficult. I've been told that I'm difficult. But what I think that boils down to meaning is, oh, he or she wants to get it right. And they're not, in television, if nobody falls down, you print it. And the idea of directing an actor, shaping a performance, which is something that I'm prepared to do. I come out of theater where you direct actors and you shape. That's a different process. I didn't have difficulties with the cast at all that I recollect.
What are some of your memories of Leonard, Shell, DeForest, and James? Some of your memories of them?
Well, I have lots of memories, but I don't know how to sort of pluck them out of thin air. One of the more interesting experiences I had was directing Ricardo Montalban as Khan, because he was the biggest star of all. And he had not been part of our rehearsal process. I like to rehearse. I think that actors get to know each other, get to know the material, and get to know the director, because they really want to know one thing about the director, which Ed Zwick explained to me years ago. Is he crazy? Am I going to live? Do I have to pull the boat over the mountain? And so rehearsals are good because you sort of learn about the project, you learn about the director, you learn about each other, and you learn about how many words you can cut out of the script, which is important, because if you don't cut them out beforehand, you're going to have to shoot them, and then you're going to have to edit them. So all of that was very handy, but Ricardo wasn't part of it because he was shooting his television series, Fantasy Island. So I had lunch with him. At one point, he was a courtly gentleman, didn't reveal much, very polite, very courteous. And I gave him a copy of Moby Dick, and I said, read this, it's all here. And then he showed up on the first day of shooting in full drag as Khan. That's his real chest. I have to always answer that fucking question. It's unbelievable.
It's incredible, isn't it? I got asked that question too, and I said, I wasn't there for that. How would I know? But of course it is.
He used to get up at 5 a.m. and work out, and this was a very athletic, fit guy. But when we rehearsed his opening scene in the cargo bays, where we learn why Khan is so pissed off at Kirk, Admiral Kirk never bothered to check on our progress. He yelled the whole thing at the top of his lungs, and we're all standing around going, whoa. And this is only the second movie I've ever directed, and this guy's a mile tall and a whole bunch of other things. And I thought, is he going to punch me out if I try to tell him something? So anyway, because I still, you couldn't get past that sort of courtly, courteous politesse. So I said, okay, let's go into your dressing room, your trailer, whatever it was. and talk about interpretation while the crew does its lighting. So he inclined his head and we sat down, and he was waiting, and I'm thinking, how do I do this? And I said, Laurence Olivier once said that an actor should never show an audience his top, because once they see your top, they know you got no place else to go.
Mm.
And he looked at me and he goes, "Oh, you're going to direct me?" He said, "That's great. I don't know what I'm doing up there. I need all the help I can get." And that was the beginning of, what, as Captain Reno says in Casablanca, was a beautiful friendship. And I've often said that directing Ricardo was the only time I've ever driven a Maserati. This is what it was like. It was a very detailed, intimate collaboration, and very, very rewarding, obviously.
Oh, clearly, my gosh. Well, Gene Roddenberry had written his own script for Star Trek II, which was rejected, and he was taken off the lead for the project. How much interaction did you have with him, and how was that?
Well, I never knew that he'd written a screenplay. It's the first time I ever heard of it just now. People have asked me about my relations with Gene Roddenberry, and what I've learned is that I have a very good memory. Some people would say an exceptional memory, but it isn't perfect. And I found this out because people would say to me, what was your relations with Gene Roddenberry making The Wrath of Khan? And I said, well, I don't, I met him. I think you were supposed to meet him. I don't think he had anything to do with, I never saw him on the set. And all of that part was accurate. He wasn't involved in making the movie. But I went back to the University of Iowa, where the library has my papers. And in honor of my visit, they put on an exhibit. And in that exhibit was a whole bunch of memoranda between me and Gene Roddenberry about my screenplay for what became known as The Wrath of Khan, and he hated it. And he sent me testy, multi-page, single-spaced memoranda, to which I responded with equally testy, defensive, and probably fresh retaliations. And I had blocked all this. Didn't remember any of it.
Wow.
But since he wasn't involved, he could say whatever he wanted, but I could more or less do whatever I wanted.
We want to discuss The Day After, which was the highest rated television show in history. I remember that show, with news stations warning viewers not to watch it alone. How did you become to get involved in that one?
After Star Trek II, I can't remember the details, but I became I think the third director to be offered this movie. And I was to go from directing features at the time to going to direct television. That was considered a step down to do that. I read this script and I was being psychoanalyzed at the time. Now, formal psychoanalysis, which I don't think many people do, it's a very, very expensive, very tedious. It's like flying. You're either bored or terrified. There's no middle section to it. You lie on a couch and you talk to the ceiling, and you're shrink doesn't say anything. You're doing the heavy lifting. And so I was lying on the couch trying to rationalize my way out of not directing this movie. I mean, nuclear war, who wants to think about nuclear war? Nobody wants to think about it, which is a pity, because we better, because it's around the corner. More around the corner now, by the way, than in 1982 when this conversation was taking place. And my shrink finally opened his mouth, really startling me, and said, "Well, I think this is where we find out who you really are."
Mm.
And that was sort of checkmate. So I knew I was going to have to do the movie. And that's how I wound up doing it.
Mm. Well, there was so much buzz leading up to the show. Was there a concern that it was too overhyped?
How could it be too overhyped?
Yeah, well,
There's nothing like being banned in Boston. In order to, I think it was the overhyping that made all these people watch it. So everybody saying, "Don't watch this movie. Don't watch this movie alone. Don't watch it with your priest. Watch it with your kids. You know, watch it from a fallout shelter, whatever." I mean, the night that it was on, I was watching it with my fiance, and I said, "Be honest. If this weren't my movie, would you be sitting through it? Because I'm not sure I would. This is horrifying." I mean, and by the way, it's still horrifying. And one of the interesting things about the movie that I had discovered in the process of making it, going back to this notion that nobody wants to think about nuclear war, I realize that people will do anything not to think about nuclear war. And therefore, I didn't want to make a good movie, because if I made a good movie, people would talk about the movie. They would say, "Wow, the cinematography, did you see that?" Or "Joe Beth Williams, was she incredible or what? And how about that catchy title song?" I knew if the movie were, quote, good as a work of cinema, we would find another way to duck out on it. And even when the movie came out, the press, they didn't want to talk about nuclear war. All they wanted to talk about was who started it. Anything not to think about nuclear war. And we are now so close. We are entering World War III. And I have to say that up to this point, luck or hope is not a strategy. The fact that we haven't blown ourselves to kingdom come right now is an accident. There have been nuclear accidents. 2 nuclear bombs were dropped on North Carolina. They didn't go off. If you want to Google Arkansas monkey wrench missile silo, you will find that we almost blew up Arkansas when a monkey wrench dropped down a missile silo, opened a fuel line, and precipitated this awful chain of events. We are hanging by a thread, and nobody wants to think about that thread or seemingly do things about it. Incidentally, I will tell you 2 things. There is a documentary out about the making of The Day After, and it's called Television Event. Television Event is on YouTube, I believe. And it tells the whole story, and I'm in it, if that's any inducement. I hear that Fox Searchlight has bought the rights to the documentary to make a feature film about the making of The Day After. I know this because I had to sell my life rights to Fox Searchlight. There's also on November 15th, a new book being published called Apocalypse Television, or Television Apocalypse. And Television Apocalypse by, I think his name is David Craig. I think that's his name, is about the making of The Day After. And the introduction to the book is written by Bob Iger. I haven't read it. I haven't read the book. I don't know how I come out, but The Day After is not going anywhere. We're now at the day before.
Well, yeah, you could ask how you felt about that.
Yeah, because I again, two more cents for me. It had to be the most sobering piece of, well, we'll call it cinema, so I don't drag you back into that concern. The most impactful thing I have ever seen, period, and it haunts me to this day. It haunted me back then. So yeah, I might not want to talk about it, but I certainly can't ever stop thinking about it.
Well, the question is not whether you want to talk about it. I don't care, but what do you want to do about it?
Yeah.
And one of the things that The Day After is generally conceded to have done, and maybe for the last time, is that everybody in the United States, 100 million people, everybody around the world, whether you're talking about Europe or even in Russia or Cuba, finally focused on one thing for whatever it was, a couple hours of this thing, and everybody talked about it, marched about it, met about it. And people, I receive letters almost daily from private citizens and scientists saying, how can we remake this movie? And I've gone to streamers with a proposal to do a global version of The Day After. And they are no more interested in doing that than ABC was interested in doing The Day After movie to begin with. Nobody wants to touch this third rail, this live wire. So and there's a lecture on YouTube. I think it's called The AI Dilemma. And it's a terrific, but it's upsetting, this lecture. And they use The Day After as an example halfway through the lecture of the one time everybody focused on the same thing. And by the way, even professional politicians were shocked by the movie because it's suddenly, they say one picture is worth 1,000 words. And when you see those missiles take off, that's different. Ronald Reagan, who was at the time president, came to power believing in a winnable nuclear war. 20 million people dead tops, acceptable, statistics, abstract. But when he saw the movie, he freaked out. And there's a lot of evidence that he freaked out. He wrote about it in his memoir. His biographer, Edmund Morris, who had won the Pulitzer for The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, was in the White House as his official biographer, said it was the only time he ever saw him lose it. And ultimately, he lost it to the degree that he went to Reykjavik, Iceland, met with Soviet Premier Gorbachev, and signed the Intermediate Range Missile Treaty. And Daniel Ellsberg, whom I got to know in the last year of his life, said to me, the treaty that resulted from your movie is the only treaty that resulted in the physical dismantling of nuclear weapons.
Well, we were going to ask you about the Reagan. So you do think that it had, because I had read that it directly had an impact in foreign policy. So you have heard that confirming that.
It did.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah, remains probably the most worthwhile thing I've gotten to do with my life. It was sort of an accident, you know. Now this is where we find out who you really are.
Well, your memoir, your memoir, View from the Bridge. What made you decide to write that?
Oh, it was probably another Writers Guild strike, and I said I need to make some money, and my agent said, write your memoir.
Well, I'm certainly grateful you did very much.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, okay, so the day after, so important, but how ironic is it to you that now you're so identified with Star Trek when you weren't even a fan of it growing up? What do you think about that?
Well, I feel a little bit like, well, how do I answer this? Sorry about the noise in the background. I can't help it.
We don't. I don't hear it at my end. So
okay. Oh, good.
Yeah.
You know, as I fantasize if I would ever get an obituary, what they would say about me, and I think I'm accurate in saying that my legacy, and I put that in quotes because it sounds a little pretentious, rests on three things. It rests on Sherlock Holmes, Star Trek, and the day after. Those are my sort of quote claims to fame. And I feel a little bit about Star Trek and also about Sherlock Holmes in a way, the way Arthur Conan Doyle felt about Sherlock Holmes. He could do it, but he didn't necessarily get it. And he thought that Sherlock Holmes took attention away from the things that he felt were more important. His historical novels, The White Company, his science fiction, The Lost World, which is basically King Kong. And he was sort of grouchy about his relations with Sherlock Holmes. You know, he tried to kill him off, and the guy wouldn't stay dead. And I would like to think that I've learned from his example that I am not going to be grouchy about the fact that people have enjoyed my Star Trek movies. That's great. I'll take it. I just feel lucky that I got to do them. I feel lucky that I got to do the day after. Feel lucky.
You mentioned you're still writing Sherlock Holmes. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's
sorry.
No, I just somebody recommended a general to Napoleon and said, this guy's an awful good general. And Napoleon said, I know he's good, but is he lucky? And I think I've been extremely lucky, and I'm not going to look down my nose or sneer at my luck.
Well, Nick, we want to thank you so much for joining us today. We had such a treat to get to talk to you and hear your stories. It's a pleasure. We've been looking forward to this for a long time.
Good to see you, Ike.
You too, 100%.
Take care there in Florida. What?
Yes. I'm Jonathan Rosen with Ike Eisenmann. Again, a very special thanks to Nicholas Meyer. And please subscribe.
Thank you for listening to Pop Culture Retro, where no one was hurt during the making of this podcast.